Welcome, everybody, to week 3 of our summer series, Hero of the Faith. My name's Pastor Callum, and it's great to see you all. So, today we're going to be looking at a very interesting but very well known character named Abraham. Many people have heard of Abraham. He crops up in the New and the Old Testament, and he's fundamental to the picture of Israel, not only in the Old but also in the New. So he's a very important character and he's good to learn about. There's lots of details, there's lots of opinions about him. But he's one of those characters like Noah where God starts over with. And I don't know about you, but I know this idea of God starting over sounds very weird. It's almost like, okay, God's got a plan B, C. But no, this is part of God's plan. Everything prior to Abraham is humanity, and this is the first story where we come to the people of Israel, where there's a very interesting setting apart of a nation. So to understand Abraham located in Genesis 12, we need to understand the context. And the context of Genesis 12 is Genesis 11 and Genesis 10. And obviously everything before that, but these are the important parts. So before we jump into the story of Abraham, let's understand the context of the story. Why is Abraham so important and where does he come from? So if we jump all the way back to Noah, we have his story as we studied last week, and he has his son, Ham. And Ham is the one that uncovered the nakedness of his father, and he was the cursed one of Canaan. Well, today's story picks up from there with actually his grandson. And his son named Cush, his son, Cush, fathered Nimrod. And we read in Genesis 10, Cush fathered Nimrod. He was the first on the earth to be a mighty man. He was mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, which in Akkadian is Uruk, Akkad, or as we know Akkad, Calneh, in the land of Shinar. From that land, he went into Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calah, Resen, Nineveh, Calah. That is the great city. And so we have this narrative, this depiction of history. And Genesis 10 is a very interesting chapter because if you read Genesis 10, there's lots of details. There's lots of information. And you always sat there, like when you see those lists of so-and-so fathered so-and-so, so-and-so, you always go, oh, why? Why must I read this? Or you struggle to take anything from it. And actually, this is one of those lists that's not like that. In this list is a very interesting story because the context to Genesis 10 is it's the table of nations. This is the forming of various nations. And Cush, or Nimrod, is the father of the Akkadian kind of nation. We see that Babel, Uruk, and Akkad are all part of this Akkadian empire. And they are part of this story being painted of the people of Shinar. And we will get into this in more detail soon, but these people groups that we read in Genesis 10 are pictured in Genesis 11. No, in Isaiah 11 even. And in Isaiah 11:11 we read, "And this shall happen on that day. The Lord again will extend his hand a second time, and to acquire the remnant of the people left from Assyria, Egypt, Pathros, Cush, Elham, Shinar, Hamath, and the coastlands of the sea." So we see Shinar on that list, we see Cush on that list, we see Assyria on that list, and if you read Genesis 10, Egypt is there, and Egypt is on this list. So there's a big overlap here that these nations are the nations surrounding Israel, but they're also portrayed as like a contrast between Israel, the good, or not the good, but God's people, and these other nations which are dedicated to other gods in rebellion against God. And God needs to pull his people out of them, set them apart. So that's this whole theme being set up in Genesis 10 with the table of nations. And we see that they are obviously later painted as like opponents. And Nimrod being a leader of one of these nations, the Akkadian lands and the Sumerian empires of this time, and both of these lands later become Babylon. So this is where the word Shinar is very important. So Shinar is the land of Babylon, is the land that became Babylon. And that's where you have this lineage of the Akkadian Empire. If you study the history, you'll see the Akkadian Empire, one of the first empires to come up, and the Sumerian Empire. And from these lands comes the Babylonian Empire. So that's where this theme is being picked on. And that's why this is very important, because if you know much about Babylon, Babylon is the anti-kingdom. It's the anti-kingdom against the kingdom of God. So Genesis 10 and Genesis 11 are painting this picture of these, almost these, the fathering of the nations, all of these nations that we know later become opponents of God. And we see then in Genesis 11, we read this, the well-known story of the Tower of Babel. And we read in Genesis 11 verse 2, as the people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had bricks for stone, bitumen for mortar. And they said, come and let us build ourselves a city and a tower, with the top in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. So the word you see again in Genesis 11, this word Shinar. So it's located in the lands to be, that will be Babylon. And Babel being the city, the regional city of one of the big cities that Nimrod founded. So this is within the empire of Nimrod. To say whether it's the scholars, some scholars say it is from Nimrod, who's the one that did so, others don't. There's all that disagreement and detail over that. But all we need to know is that it is in Babylon. It is in Shinar. It is the town, the city of Babel, in the region of Babel, is built. The city is built. And so that's where we have this detail. And so it's good to note that Genesis 10 and Genesis 11 kind of paint the same story, and that's where we see this overlap. Because Genesis 10 gives this lovely detail of kind of what happened in an overview. But then Genesis 11 kind of gives the detail, the finer detail, the important detail. It digs deep, so you have the Genesis 10, and then Genesis 11 kind of puts this detail within the text. And so there's a lot to this story. So they decide to build themselves a city. So logical, on a plain, nice space, build a city. But they build a tower for themselves. Well, classic temple towers were normally built at the highest points. And so to build it on a plain shows the height of the tower they were planning. But also, this temple, this tower, would have been a ziggurat. And a ziggurat is, if you studied any history, is one of the Babylonian places that they used to be a dwelling place for their god, but it would be built on a mountain. They would have a ziggurat dedicated to a god on a mountain. And so they dedicate it to themselves to show that they are their own gods. They are the gods of themselves. They don't need God. So you have this multi-element rebellion going on. So they go against the command of God not to multiply. They come together. They don't want to come under him as God, but make a name for themselves. And if you've been following our Sunday series, making a name for yourself is like creating your own family name. So coming out of God's, not being part of God's representatives, but being their own representatives, their own name. And they also want to build their own tower, their own power structure in a sense, where they are going, look, we have our own tower dedicated to ourselves, and we are our own gods. So, and then you obviously have in the text, if you may have heard from Pastor Frank before, they build it with a waterproof mentality. They build it so we have the bricks, we have the mortar to kind of make it waterproof. So if God were to send another flood, we're safe. So they have this whole element of rebellion in mind. And this is the context where God then comes in, and we read in Deuteronomy 32, and he says, the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, to the nations their inheritance. When he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the people, according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted inheritance. So we see from this point, this is where God creates his segregation of Israel from the other nations. God disinherits the other nations, but keeps Israel. And this is where Abraham comes in. And after this story of the flood, the Tower of Babel, after this this narrative where God disperses them, he confuses them. Out of that, a few verses later, we read in Genesis 31, Terah took Abraham, Terah, the father of Abraham, took Abram, his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, and his grandson, and Sarah, his daughter-in-law, and Abram's wife, and they went forth together from Ur. Ur was part of the Akkadian region of the Chaldeans, part of the Babylonian Shinar land, to go into the land of Canaan. But when he came to Haran, they settled there. So Ur was the capital of the old Sumerian Empire. At this point, we estimate that this time was at the end of the third Ur dynasty. So around 1800 BC, and the Akkadian Empire had fallen, all of these things have moved on. We've gone down, progressed through time a bit. And this is the powers have kind of been dispersed. So this kind of story fits with the falling of the Ur dynasty, where the dynasty falls, peoples spread. So it kind of fits with this Babel story. It's not to say that they are, but you see the parallels. And from this is where we see, in Hebrews 11, where we join the story of Abraham. And Abraham being one of those out of the nation of Babel. He comes from the nation of Shinar, from Ur, from this land. So God takes Abraham out of these other nations. So we really see this disinheritance of the others and this portion of Israel being pulled out. So this is where we join Abraham. And we find when it says, by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out of a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. As he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs of the same promise, for he was looking forward to a city that had foundations, whose designer and builder is God. So this is the beginning. At the end, this is found in Genesis 12. So this is now the turning point. God disinherits the nations. He pulls out Abraham in Genesis 11 and Ud, his father, and from here he then calls Abraham out of there to become Israel, or the nation, to become the nation of Israel in the future. So we read this section we said in Hebrews 11 here in Genesis 12, where it says, "Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I will show you. The command is clear, to go home, take your family, all that you have, and go into the land that you don't know. And you will just need to follow God until he shows you where he needs to be." This is what God is saying. And this is where we see this act of faith in Hebrews 11, where he obeyed. And I think we've all had this experience in one way, shape, or form. God calls us out from where we were. We were in our own life, doing our own things in one way, shape, or form. We grew up with a history of a childhood, with an upbringing that set us on a path. Each one of us has had different paths. But God says to Abraham, take all that you have, your possessions, your dreams, scrap all the plans that you had, drop your income, drop your security, your family security, your social security of being with others, and your culture, all that you know, and go to a place that I will show you. And this is what God is saying to Abraham. And this is what makes this so interesting, because he says, you do this, and this is what I'll do for you in return. And we read then in Genesis 12:2, "And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in all the families of the earth you shall be blessed. Of the earth shall be blessed." These two verses give the purpose to the call. God calls Abraham and expects him to go by faith, which he does. And the purpose of that is so he will be this nation of God, his inheritance, to be a blessing to the other nations. This is the plan of God now. Instead of trying to work through all the nations, he wants to take one nation and use it to bless the other nations, to still reach the same goal, still have a family throughout the earth, but instead of using every nation because of their rebellion, he says, I'm going to take one and use this one to bless them all. And this is this idea. And so this was Abraham's first test to trust God, to see where he would lead him, because he left home not knowing where he was going, because God said to the land, I will show you. And he had to trust that God would be faithful to the promise that he said, I will lead you to where you need to be. And the hard but crucial part is that the fruit or the result didn't come at the end of the journey. It wasn't like the Exodus where they knew they had an end goal. Unfortunately, this promise that Abraham was given by faith took a little bit longer to reach fulfillment. And he would only get to see glimpses in his life. And this is this challenge that God put to him. He had a high expectation of faith on Abraham, because he was like, I've got big things for you. And for each one of us, when God wants to do something big with us, he increases the level of faith needed to act upon it. And sometimes that means for us that we need to leave our families, leave our social security, leave our cultural security. Don't know about you, but when you come to Jesus, there's a lot of those things that you have to let go. Where maybe you lose family members, maybe you've lost social security, maybe you've lost financial security, maybe you've lost friendships. There's all of these things that, like Abraham, when we are called out of the old, things change. We are called to be God's people, to be his. And that means sometimes we have to sacrifice some things. And this is what Abraham had to do. And so that's one of the lessons we can learn from Abraham, is this element of faith, but through sacrifice. It's not easy, it's not nice, but it's part of it. I know from when you've been listening to Pastor Frank, he would always say how he had to basically sell everything, pack himself up, and travel to Belgium. He left his social security. He left his cultural security. He had to learn a new language. He had to learn a new culture. And it's the same with this idea when we become a Christian. We have to learn a new culture, a new way of working, a new way of thinking, a new environment, a new family. And this family is an amazing family, one that will love us, one that will care for us, one that will build us up. But it takes that process time to adjust to a new family. Like when you're newlyweds, you have to learn to adjust to be with your parents-in-law. They're a new family for you. And at the beginning of when you first meet them, you're like, okay, who are you? What can I expect from you? There's this awkwardness of learning to know each other. But once you know each other, once you can engage and become family, you build these family roots that are deep and that are strong. And so this is the same promise God has for Abraham. So Abraham, and we carry on reading. So Abraham went as the Lord told him, and took Lot Lot went with him. Abraham was 75 years old when he departed Haran. Abraham took Sarah his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set off to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abraham passed through the land to the place of Shechem, to the oak of Moreh, and at the time the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord, who appeared to him. And from there he moved to the hill country, onto the east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent. With Bethel to the west, Ai to the east, there he built an altar to the Lord, and called upon the name of the Lord. Abraham journeyed on, still going towards the Negeb. Now, Abraham traveled through the whole of the land, more or less, that we know as Israel. Negeb, or Negev, is the desert at the south of Israel. So we know that he came from the north and traveled through on a specific route. Obviously, you may recognize some of the names, Bethel, and Bethel, because the author is obviously writing from a post-context element, because Bethel changed its name with Jacob. So he's writing from a post-context, knowing the later name. So that's where we see these names come in. But unfortunately, we don't have time to go into the whole detail of Abraham, but we do get to see that the first stage of Abraham's story was this leaving by faith. He dropped everything and he took the step of faith. Then we get through this very interesting section where he has to negotiate with the new people. He goes to Egypt and he enters Egypt and he's scared that they're going to steal his wife. So he says it's his sister. And as a result, we see God's blessing on him in a sense of one, they take his sister and they incorporate him into the land. What do we see? Something bad happens. Because in Genesis 12 it said, all of those who dishonor you, I will curse. So in Genesis 2:12-17, the Pharaoh had taken his sister and without knowing had dishonored Abraham. And so this curse God brings upon him. And the Lord, and it says in verse 17, but the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abraham's wife. So we see this representative of God, Abraham. What he does and how he acts affects the things around him. And this is almost like the second element of Abraham's life, is he is a representative of God. This family, he's pulled out, and whatever is enacted around Abraham affects the wider environment. He goes and lives in Egypt, they're blessed, but if they act badly upon him, they're cursed. Wherever he goes, he has an impact. And I think that's also for us is this element of we are representatives, and wherever we go, we get to have an impact. Through us, we can be a blessing, where we bless people with the gospel, we bless people with the good news, we bless people with the things of God. But if people dishonor us, we dishonor the family that we represent, then God will bring in the end his curse upon them, his judgment upon them. So that's this element where Abraham, like we are, is this representative by faith. And we also see this through the bad things he does, as well as the good. So the good, where he goes, he blesses, he builds up. The bad, where he lies and gets in trouble and it causes curse. But also through the lack of faith of Sarah when they had Ishmael. Ishmael through Hagar. Well, what happens? They kick her out because they get jealous and all of this story. But what God is still faithful to his promise on Abraham. Because Ishmael is still a father of a nation. Even though he comes through a physical means, this blessing on Abraham still has effect upon his descendants, whether by faith or by flesh. And Ishmael, even though he's by flesh, not faith, he's still blessed. He's still made into a nation which we know goes on to the lineage of the Islamic and Arabian tribes, or the Arabian tribes which eventually lead on to Islam. And Islam hold Ishmael and Abraham as a hero of their faith. So now in Hebrews, we turn away not just from Abraham, and we incorporate Sarah as well. And because both of them in this next part of the story have to act on faith and are challenged, like we are. Because not only was Abraham blessed, he was called out, but he was pushed to the furthest limits of his faith. And we see this, that as they got older, they waged wars, they lived their lives, and they're now getting old. And so now Abraham is getting old. God comes to him and says, you're going to have a son. That promise I made years ago, which you acted upon and you believed, now it's going to come into fulfillment, where you're going to have a descendant. And Abraham's going, what do you mean I'm going to have a descendant? I'm beyond age of having children. My wife's beyond age of having children. This is impossible. And they laugh. And that moment has an impact. When they laugh, that defines the name of their child. Because the name of their child is Isaac. And Isaac's name literally means he will laugh. And it's reflecting the laughter and the disbelief that Abraham and Sarah had when God told them they would have a child. But yet, that's not what defines them. That moment of disbelief, although it defines the name of their child, it doesn't define the legacy. Because the legacy still goes on. The promise still goes on. And by faith, we read in Hebrews 12, by faith, 11:12, by faith, Sarah received power to conceive. Even though she was past age, she was considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, him as any good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven, as many as the innumerable grains of the sand by the seashore. So despite their lack of faith of receiving the news, Sarah is still considered faith by faith, a hero of the faith. And she manages to change. Well, it's not an immediate, in a sense of they had a moment of disbelief, but yet still by the end of the story, she's considered someone of faith. And reflection, she's considered someone of faith. And so this is one of the commentaries saying is that the change in the text, it doesn't seem to try and avoid the difficulty. And actually what it says is that although she had disbelief when she first received the news, it turned to faith over time. She became a woman of faith. Although she was a woman of disbelief when she received the news, through that change, she matured, she growed, to the fact that by the time she gave birth, she was a woman of faith. She was a lady that believed in the promise of God, and the conviction that God was faithful to the promise. So this Hebrews perspective says that we may have moments of disbelief. We may have moments where we struggle. But they don't have to define us, because we can take that moment, learn from it, reflect upon it, and grow and become a person of faith. That something we did in error or disbelief can become a moment of faith. But we need to be willing to work on it and change and grow into a person of faith. It's a change of attitude, a change of mentality. And God gives us the grace to do so. He doesn't hold those moments of disbelief as the final moment. That's part of the gospel is, we may have chosen to have made a mistake, but God is still faithful to redeem those moments to build his kingdom. And we see the same in Abraham. We saw in Genesis 12 and Genesis 20, you can read, where he's scared that he will lose his wife, that he will be killed. But now we see a transformation. Because if we come to this well-known story in 22 of the sacrifice of Isaac. And so after all of these things, God tested Abraham, and we read, and God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, he said, here I am, he said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go into the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I shall tell you. Same kind of mentality. Go where I'm going to tell you. Do what I'm going to ask of you. So Abraham rose in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place that God had told him. So we have this element of faith where he's going, okay, God, but he's taking men, he's taking his son, he's prepared. And on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to the young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. He took it on his hands. He took his hands the fire and he took in his hands the fire and the knife. So they both went with them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. And he said, behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. So they both went of them together. So here we see the faith. Abraham knew that God made a promise and that God would provide his son, his lineage. But he also knew that God would ask of him things which are difficult, but God would provide for him regardless. And he was willing to lay down the promise of God back to him, saying, look, you've given me this promise, I'm happy to have it, but if you want to challenge me on it, here, you can have it back. And I'm still trusting that you're going to come through. And so when they came to that place, and we read further, God told him, Abraham, build the altar there and lay the wood in order and bound Isaac, his son, and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand, took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. He said, here I am. He said, do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him, for I now know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. So we see here in that verse 10 that Abraham stopped by the Lord's angel, the incarnate God in an angel-like form. And this test proved that not only did Abraham trust God, but he feared him enough to act in obedience no matter how difficult it was. And that was an expression used by Abraham that to fear God means to believe in him fully, to be absolutely loyal to everything he asks. And many of us, we have dreams, we have desires, we have things spoken over us, and we hold on to them and go, yes, God, please let me see this pass. Let me see this come to be. But what we can learn from Abraham is we need to be willing to let God fulfill it. It's not our job to make it come into fulfillment, rather than to follow his directives. And sometimes we need to be willing to take that promise, no matter how big or great or small, and lay it back on the table, or the altar in this case, and say, here you are, God. I am willing to sacrifice it if you be so, and I will trust you to fulfill it, regardless. But we also saw that in telling the other men, he said, my son and I, we are still coming back. God is still going to be faithful. He could even raise him back from the dead, so be it. He always had this element of faith, of trusting that God would provide on the promise, no matter what was going to happen. And this is the contrast. This is the changed Abraham. He doesn't try to wiggle around. He doesn't lie. He doesn't deceive. He's not just trying to make the best for himself or to escape or keep himself safe. No. He is changed. He's a man that trusts God, that is willing to face difficulty, to be willing to take the hard route. He's not scared of something bad happening. He's clear. He's honest. We see a different Abraham on the mountain because God has worked through him and the faith has transformed him. And these are the lessons that we can learn from Abraham. These lessons of faith that we need to be willing to have a learning and teachable heart. That teachable and learned heart will transform us. That we could be willing to follow God's directives and be willing to lay our dreams on the table and say, I know you, God. You are the one that can fulfill this. Only you can truly fulfill this. So I'm trusting you to provide it. And I believe that's something we can really learn and grow in. Is that because these things, if we don't take them and give them to him, they can be a baggage. I know for myself, I've had promises and prophecies that became a baggage sometimes because I got so focused on them and so hooked up over them. But rather, God said to me, lay it back on the table. Trust that I will fulfill it in my timing. And I did so, and that whole weight of it became a burden was released. So I want to encourage you, whatever God has said on your life, whatever God is doing with you, maybe like Abraham, you have to be willing to lay down some things, to travel to a new place, to become the people he's called us to be. Or maybe you have some things in your life that you idolize or have become so cling to that they've become a burden. And we need to learn to let them go and become the man of faith or woman of faith that God has called us to be, and to be transformed by that faith. So I hope you were able to relate with that. I hope you enjoyed that. That was a very interesting and deep, challenging discussion of Abraham. And so may I bless you, and may you have a great week, and hopefully see you on Sunday. And we'll also see you next week for part 4. God bless.